it can feel quite a threatening thing to think, actually, I'm going to release people to do this. I'm going to send them away almost. I'm going to say, don't come and serve in this ministry. I'm going to ask you to stay connected, but actually step out of this in order to form something new. It feels threatening in terms of it could go wrong. It could, I'm losing a really good resource and person within my church community. But we do it for two reasons. One is for the sake of the lost who otherwise won't connect with church. And the second is for the release of people into their calling, their vocation, and the potential of what that happens.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pivot Podcast, where we explore how the church can faithfully navigate a changing world. I'm Dwight Shiley.
And I'm Terry Elton. And today we're excited to talk with John McGinley, the Executive Director of Myriad. John is working with a team to equip ordinary Christians who are planting new worshiping communities across the UK. What started in 2022 as a single training hub with 10 teams has now grown into 12 hubs supporting over 100 teams and more than 400 people. Myriad is equipping everyday disciples to start something new in their communities, workplaces, and neighborhoods. John, welcome to the Pivot Podcast.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So, John, let's start by hearing a bit more about your story. How did you come to this work of equipping lay people to plant churches? What in your ministry journey convinced you that this was the direction the Spirit was leading?
So I'll keep it short because I've been ordained in the Church of England for 30 years. So that's my journey of ministry. But in that call to ordination, I really felt God frame it within the Great Commission and a sense of him calling me to explore how we can call the church back to being a disciple-making movement. So in those 30 years, it's been a sense of a loyal disruption within the Church of England. It's a sense of that's the place of my calling, but I've been seeking to find what's it going to mean and what kind of churches are going to allow every believer to be a disciple that's involved in making new disciples. So I explored that through church planting. Peter Wagner famously said that the single most effective way to fulfill the Great Commission and evangelism is to plant new churches. And so right from the beginning, and 30 years ago, we were planting churches before it really had very much opportunity in the UK. And then out of that, I then began to look at how do we actually create missional communities? So it isn't just ordained leaders who are planting these churches. And how do we equip ordinary believers to go and reach out and to form communities that will make new disciples? And that journey was one in which I saw God move and saw many people come to know Jesus. But there was this growing frustration, a holy discontent that if we're going to reach the UK with the gospel again, it has to be faster. And the way in which the Church of England was planting churches using ordained leaders, it felt too slow, and it takes 7 years to train an ordained leader. It felt too expensive. They need a stipend and salary to do that. And it felt very bound to buildings, so that the church had to have one of the established buildings. And I began to imagine, what would it look like if we just equipped ordinary people and said, where God's put you, you could be called by God to form a new church community. You could be called by God to reach people in a fresh way. And so we began to explore that in Leicester, where I was a vicar of that, and we saw some fruit of that. And then I got in touch with my friend Rick Thorpe, who's a bishop in the Church of England, and said, could we do this across the church? And he said, okay, let's explore what this might mean. And we started to talk to the Church of England. And in the midst of all of those conversations, incredibly, and this for me is a real sign that this is genuinely a work of the Spirit, the Church of England said, we want to see 10,000 new worshipping communities birthed out of Church of England churches. And I said, I just want to serve that. I want to see God do something like that in our nation. And so that's something of the journey and the conviction that's led me to where we are today.
I love that. That's a very fun spirit-led story. I want to go back to the 2021 report, listening to the voice of the lay planter. And that's really in connection where Myriad began. What did you hear from those conversations that made this so foundational for the work that you do?
Yeah, so the background to that was, if you imagine that the Church of England has this training process for its ministers that is really sort of thorough and robust. It's based in seminaries and is, really well invested in. We then began to think, what's it going to look like to train these ordinary people to start new church communities? What do they need? How's that going to work in the midst of their lives and their families, their work that they need to do alongside this? So we went to look for the people who'd already done this. And so we found 20 non-ordained people who were doing this voluntarily. And the key for us was they'd been doing it for more than 2 years. So that this was something that they'd sustained and they'd been fruitful. And we asked them, really, what has it been to enable you to achieve this? What did you need? What was helpful? What was unhelpful? And these were leaders who were a variety of ages, backgrounds, genders, contexts as well, rural, urban. And the amazing thing was that across all of those different contexts and leaders, they all said 3 things. Now, they said a lot of other different things, but they said 3 key things that they said this is what made the difference. The first one was that they had what we've termed a champion, an experienced leader, quite often ordained leader, who was there to encourage them, mentor them, guide them, give them permission, validate their call and their ministry. So that was key in every story in some way. Secondly, even though there wasn't something called Myriad and there wasn't the equivalent at the time, they went and found a community of people who were trying to do something similar to them. And they said that having friends on the journey was absolutely crucial for them. And then the last thing, which was really interesting, was that they didn't go and get a training course up front, but they started what they did and they learnt on the job, they made mistakes, but when they needed training, they went and got it. And they all spoke of the importance of investment and training. So we heard those 3 things, and then we shaped our Myriad learning pathway around those 3 principles, establishing really good relationships with experienced leaders who will champion them, creating a community that people journey with over a period of time so that they've got supportive relationships in that journey, and that we give training on the job so they can begin immediately. You don't have to get qualified in order to do this, but as you go through this process, we're going to give you training that relates to what you're trying to do.
Well, so tell us more a bit about that pathway, right? The Myriad pathway, the training pathway that you then went on to develop. So it's not a quick training course. It's a 2.5-year journey, if I understand correctly. And what happens during those years? Give us a bit of a sense of the arc of it.
So if we imagine who might be starting this journey, so they're quite often somebody who has got a sense of, I long to reach these people that are disconnected from church, that they might be in a certain place within their parish. They might be in a network of people that aren't represented in the congregation in that place. But they've got a sense of, could I be used by God to reach those people? And so they come to us because their ordained leader has recognized it in them, or they've got in touch with us. And they're saying, I don't know how to do this, but I'm willing to step into this. And so we take them on a journey over that 2.5-year period that starts, well, it has 5 stages in which we help them to discern their calling and their vision in the first stage, because this is about contextualizing the gospel, incarnating it in the place they're in. It doesn't have to all look the same. It's saying the gospel, the church has got the same essence to it, but it needs to look really different if it's going to be good news for the people you're trying to reach compared with the people in another context. So we're helping them listen to God, learn how to pray. Quite often during that period, they're just prayer walking in their community, asking God to show them what this looks like. And then out of that, they then build team, and that we train in teams because we're really convinced that individuals who aren't paid and don't have the privilege of devoting all of their time to this, we need a team to sustain this. So they gather a team and they begin to journey with us. We provide a mentor for them so that they get to meet with a mentor. And we help to establish that relationship with the sending church, an ordained leader, to oversee them, to cover safeguarding, to cover good governance and on-the-ground support. So all of that gets established in that first stage. And then they go on to think through, what's it going to look like to lead? How do we grow in leadership? How do we create a disciple-making community that's going to connect with people and actually lead people to Christ? Then how are we going to be a community that's living out what a disciple looks like in our context? So we're building a discipleship community. And then the final stage is growth and sustainability and multiplication. How are we going to see something new grow and birth something new that will come from us? So they journey in community with up to 13 other teams, and those teams will have 2 to 6 people in them. They'll meet in person every 6 months for a weekend, and then they'll meet online at other times. They'll be in a WhatsApp community to share stories and prayers and testimony. And over that 2.5-year period, the joy that I see is that they really love each other. They cheer each other on. They support each other. And although we're giving really good input, the key is that they are learning from one another. Each of their own breakthroughs become others' examples and encouragements. And when they're struggling, then they'll find support and advice from others. And it genuinely is a community that sustains them and holds them and enables them to go on that journey. One other thing that's just behind the conviction is that these small communities are really fragile, and they're really different from the established church that we've got in our inherited patterns, because they're sustained by structures and buildings and ordained leaders. And sustaining these communities is a real challenge. And so a study recently showed that after 4 years of a new worshiping community starting, only 18% of those worshiping communities will still be in existence. And so we wanted to create a pathway that actually walked with people over a period of time to get them to a place of sustainability. And rather than a training course up front where we give you the 10 principles and then we say, off you go, good luck and hope you make it, we're actually saying, no, we're gonna walk with you, and we're gonna create a community for you to support one another in.
That's really interesting, that vulnerability that you talk about, John, and to partner that with the gift is not a lot of structure, and the challenge is not a lot of structure, right? So it sounds like that time and that community really fills that gap, right?
And it creates a space and almost an environment for them to work things out within. Because if you imagine it, they haven't done this before, and because they're trying to contextualize it, it's not like they're just doing a franchise model and just repeating what others have done in a copy and paste. So they need a space to work this out, and that's what community does.
Yeah, and it's not like an expert knows better. It's you need another sojourner, right? Somebody else that's trying to contextualize, right? How did you answer this question or face this challenge?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a very churchy question because like what we were just talking about, I think is what the practitioner or the person, the lay leader doing this wants. It was designed from your listening, right? But I think the church often brings the question, well, we need quality, we need good theological depth and acumen and the ability to be accountable for things, like you said, safeguarding and things like that. So when you are thinking about the leaders being everyday disciples or people on the journey, planting these churches, how do you and your community respond to those questions? Because the questions aren't wrong, but they just come out of a totally different set of values and kind of mindset about what church is.
It's such a good question. And I think it's a really, it's not a churchy question. I think it's a really important question, because if God is doing this and we're really convinced he is, then he isn't sort of rejecting his church. He's actually trying to renew his church. And so that involves us not just throwing away everything that's gone before, but it's how is he wanting to renew this? And so our conviction is that the role of the ordained, trained, theologically trained leader needs to change in this sort of picture of the church. So rather than that they are the professional expert who is delivering worship and delivering programs for the people within the church, instead they become the equippers and the overseers of the body of Christ, to release them, as it says in Ephesians 4, to equip the people of God for ministry. Rather than saying, you're to come and help me do my ministry, actually, I'm here to help you step into your call to fulfill the mission of God in the way that he's calling you to. Now, that's a big shift. And so ordained leaders are really theologically well trained, but they often haven't been trained missionally or innovatively. And what they've been called to deliver in a, as it were, a center for worship and teaching that they're overseeing is a really different gift set than the people who are starting these embryonic, authentic grassroots communities. So for us, we're really convinced that the way in which these smaller communities are kept on track, they're resourced, they're supported through theological questions and checked in with, is through that relationship with the ordained leader. So our go-to text is Titus chapter 1, where Paul has written to Titus to tell him to go and appoint elders on the island of Crete, where they've obviously been on mission. It's not recorded in Acts, but there's been a mission. Some people have come to faith. There's these little communities. Church history say they're in the fishing villages around the edge of Crete. And Titus has been left on Crete to appoint church leaders of these little churches in these villages around the island of Crete. And Paul guides Titus to say they need to be people of good relationships, good character, and good faith. But that's all they've got, and they're new believers. And if we're really reading the Bible from the perspective you've been saying, Terry, we should be screaming at it, saying, Paul, this is irresponsible. You can't appoint church leaders like this. This is not going to work well. And I think Paul would say, so the answer to that challenge is Titus. That Titus has been with Paul. Titus has the letter from Paul to guide him on some basic theology and principles of church. He's the one who's had some insight into how the church has been forming up until now. And it's Titus that is there on Crete to have those conversations with those ordinary everyday believers who are now leading those churches. And I think if we can sort of begin to renew ordained leadership, to see it not as the delivery and the professional minister who delivers ministry as its only function, but actually to see it as the one who is equipping, guiding, sustaining, and supporting these ordinary people as they form these communities. I think that's the model that I have as a vision for the church. And I hope you're hearing in that I'm really valuing theological education, really valuing ordained leadership who are able to be called to devote their full time to that and to oversee and resource. I think without them, actually, this model doesn't work. It doesn't actually reflect the biblical pattern.
So, John, it's really fascinating to hear how you map out for us, I think, these biblical models, but then also, in relation to some common models. And I know in the States, usually there are sort of two primary ways in which churches are planted. One is often been a kind of parachute drop, professional clergy person who's sent in with the mandate, gather enough people to pay your salary within 3 years before the funding runs out kind of model, which we know doesn't work very well in many cases. Of course, the other model is what in the UK is, I think, often referred to as a resource church strategy, which is a larger team with quite a bit of money and a bunch of lay leaders, goes into either to revitalize a basically dead kind of inherited church or to start something new in a context, often urban in the case of the resource churches. And that's a very kind of more expensive approach. And so how do you see the lay-led approach that Myriad is focused on kind of as a complement to alongside that? Or how do you think about it in relation to perhaps some of the models that are more personality driven or kind of celebrity pastor kind of focused?
Yeah, I think the church is really wrestling with this in that I don't think there's something wrong in either people being resourced and sent with a sense of call in order to pioneer something new and build a church in that way, or of sending a team with sufficient resource to, as it were, arrive with the church already formed through that team sent by a really strong church. And so they begin the church from day one, and then they gather people around that. I think the celebrity pastor piece, has a sense of strength in its giftedness and the quality of what God is able to release through the level of gifting. But I think we're seeing that the risk of that is to the pressure on the professional team that's called to deliver at such a high quality. But my bigger question for all of those models is, what are you expecting or almost believing for of the people of God in those places? So most of those churches will have a vision for the best members of their churches. And the best members of those churches will turn up on a Sunday, they'll go to their small group and they'll grow in their own personal faith, they'll give financially, and they'll serve on a team to help deliver a program. And if you've got hundreds of those, you are rejoicing because they are an amazing gift to that church, and that will sustain that church and the life of that church. But none of that actually gives very much space for God to say to a member of that church, actually, I'm calling you over there and I've put you in this place. And actually who you are and the place I've put you is really crucial in the mission that I'm calling you to. And what the smaller church leadership in this way does is it says, we can't offer impressive programs or highly resourced events. What we're offering is relationship. And I genuinely think that it's very easy in some of the programs that we've established and the ways in which church is organized to never speak about love and to never talk about the quality of relationships that are taking place amongst the body of Christ. But what I see in these small organic communities is the sort of the common factors amongst them is, people often say, so what do they look like? And I'll share a few stories later, but the common factor between all of them is that they eat together. They actually just come and share food and open the scriptures and pray and belief for God to do something through them coming together as a community in their context that will reach others and draw others to faith. And that feels more like what is described in the New Testament. Just as another scripture there was a sort of a little moment of epiphany. I'm recording this on the actual day of Epiphany, the day the church celebrates Epiphany, and it's that revelation, that moment where you go, "Oh my goodness, this is who Jesus is," that the wise men had. But for me, the epiphany was John 13:35. Jesus says, "A new commandment I give you, love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, by the way that you love one another." And what I realized was, in the way that I'd been doing church, people never saw me love my brothers and sisters. They might see me love them. I might be loving them through a food bank, through a youth group, through a debt recovery center, all really important things that we used to run. But they never got included in this new community that Jesus had inaugurated and formed, in which we were loving each other in a different way than people did in the world, in which they were caused to go, "What's different about you? What's going on here?" And then we get to share that it's Jesus and his presence that's made this difference. And so what I think God's doing in the small, and it's not saying that the larger is wrong and that we can't do both, and I really do believe in a hybrid, but in the small, what you have to offer, the gold that you have to offer, is relationship and community. And that when people are included in that, and they discover something of the quality of it and the presence of Jesus in that, then that's the place that they begin to encounter him. And then when they encounter him in that community, you're not then saying to them, "Oh, you've connected with our church through this men's ministry or this youth work. We now need you to come over to where we worship and where we do this over here. Please come to us." You're actually saying, "No, we've come to you. We're staying with you. We're here, and you can grow as a Christian here, and you can help others who you know come to faith in this community, because we're networked in that same place." So the larger centers, I think, can be places of training and support, as I said, with ordained leaders sending people out. But I really do think that in these small grassroots communities, there is a chance to recover something of the relationships of love that God calls us to in his family, and to really empower every disciple to be involved in the mission of God.
I love that, John, the way that you really flipped from kind of a programmatic to a relational center, right? And some of that's just scale, but some of that is also, like you said, the depth and breadth, right? I think of how many leaders that I talked to that really mourn. I got in this because I love the ministry relationship kind of thing. And that's part of what they have to give up as their scale, right? I want to keep this going in the sense that you have worked in all kinds of contexts, right? Urban, rural, kind of hub centers, kind of, pretty remote kind of places. And if relationships is one of the kind of commonalities, maybe give some stories about how that looks different in some different contexts, but also, are there some differences or uniquenesses that context brings into this as well? So say some more about the context and how that plays in.
Yeah, and I think that this is another part of the gift of this, in that the scale of the larger church doesn't have capacity to keep contextualizing. It has quality to offer, and there's real strength in that and confidence that comes from that. But it really is a case of, this is what we offer, take it or leave it, this is who we are. Whereas in the context, you genuinely can begin to respond to what the needs are of people around you as you seek to reach people. I think the difference that context makes is quite often in the connecting point with those outside the church. So whilst the internal experience of living as a disciple in a small community based around eating together, sharing lives together, supporting one another in those rhythms of relationship is often fairly similar. The external facing of that community, of that new church community into its context is really different in different places. And so in a rural setting in the UK, because there are far fewer people living in villages and small towns, the level of relationship and connectivity across the whole of that community is so much higher. And so you're quite often not trying to reach out and reach people through a really innovative missional connecting point. You're actually just embedding a new worshiping community into that network of relationships and inviting people to come on the basis that you've thought this through for them. And so you're thinking that through, making it fit in the context, but it's not a really innovative place. Whereas in an urban setting, what you're quite often doing is you are looking for a place and a connecting point that will often be quite innovative, or a place that the church isn't connecting with. And so what church looks like in those places will often be really different according to the people you're trying to reach. And so it might be that you're meeting in a nightclub because you're trying to connect with people who are younger, and that they're connecting around the community that takes place in that place. Or it might be that you're connecting into a school and you're based in a school and you're doing something there. And so the connecting point, according to the network of people you're trying to reach in an urban area, is often really specific in an urban area, because you can't try to reach the thousands and thousands of people with a single community. So you're focusing it on a very specific network. Whereas in a rural area, you're actually saying, like in the village that I live in, there's only 1,000 people. Everybody knows somebody who knows somebody else. And so we just say to everybody, as we did at Christmas, we're going to put carols on the green, and we're going to sing Christmas carols. The pub's going to provide free beer. We're going to put lights on, and we're going to do this. And everybody comes. And we have this incredible experience of hundreds of people on the green singing carols, and we get to just share something of Jesus with them and say to them, why don't you come and join us in our new worshiping community? That's really easy in a rural area once we've built trust and built relationship, whereas in an urban area, you're doing something often much more creative. So it's in that outward facing piece that makes the real difference, I think.
Well, so John, as you think about the 100+ teams that are on the Myriad pathway currently, what are some of the most surprising or encouraging new worshiping communities that are emerging? Give us just a couple of stories that illustrates what's going on.
So my favorite story is Phil, who used to be the one of England's strongest men. There's a bodybuilding competition called the World's Strongest Man, and he was the guy that represented England. And sadly and tragically, and you can see this on YouTube, he dropped one of those enormous weights on his leg and shattered his leg and ends up in hospital. On that hospital bed, he said, that was the best day of my life because Jesus met me. But his career as a bodybuilder is over because his leg is shattered, and he's praying and he's talking with his pastor and he's talking with his friend, and he says, what can I do now? And together with his friend, Tom, they say, let's run a gym. That's all I know how to do. I've lived in a gym the whole of my life. Let's run a gym. So they buy an old fire station and they convert it into a gym in a really poor community, and they look to try and improve the health of people in that poor community and provide a real hub for that community. And in the middle of it all, Phil is just sharing his new faith with people, and people are coming to believe in Jesus. And he then realizes that these people are coming to faith, but they're not actually coming to church with him. And that's because the church he goes to isn't in that community. It's a little way away, and they're just not used to going to church. So he starts to think about this, and he thinks, could we do church in the gym? And so he comes on Myriad. He brings a couple of other people who are more experienced Christians, who've got understanding of the Christian faith and who can be pastors in that church community. They start running Alpha, so you can sign up for your aerobics class and the Alpha course on the same app in the gym. And people come to faith, and then they form a midweek discipleship group. And then they form a worshiping community on a Sunday afternoon, and it's all happening in the gym, and it's all happening in the place that people are gathering, encountering Christ, and then being discipled. And the clear testimony is there's now over 20 people who are actively following Jesus, who've come to faith through that church community in that space, who otherwise might have come to believe in him, might have encountered him, but wouldn't have found church and wouldn't have been in a place for God to really begin to transform their lives. And so that really illustrates this sense of we go to where people are at, and that the people who are best suited to form what a church community needs to look like for a particular context are the people who are in it. So people like Phil and Tom, who've never been trained to be pastors and leaders, but are the people who God has established in that place, who know what church needs to look like for those people. So that's one example of more of a community sort of workplace context. I'd love to tell you that the story that a new church community formed for people who had children with learning difficulties. So they found that to be in church with a child with additional needs, unless that church had incredible capacity, was very, very difficult, because church wasn't set up to create a space for those children. And that then made it very hard for families to actually belong to church. So they decided to form a community called Wave, where all are equally valued equally, where the wave of welcome is given to everybody. And Bernice, who had an adult daughter with Down syndrome, who'd never intended to form a church, just began to gather a community. And she formed this community, and they just started to worship really differently. The worship has got sign language as part of it. It's incredibly interactive. It's stimulating, and it affirms everybody. And what she discovered was it wasn't just that her daughter and other children and adults with additional needs were enabled to worship, but their families felt welcome in that environment. And they were participating in worship as well. And so if you go to their act of worship, it's incredibly rich. Doesn't dumb down the Christian faith at all, but it really does think creatively about how we can engage with God in a way that enables everybody to participate. And again, they're eating food every time they come together. They're sharing it as a family. And the result, again, was many, many people came to know Jesus. Many people were included within the church. A really exciting development that's happening at the moment is they are translating a gospel into sign language. So they're using symbols to write the gospel in a little booklet so that people can actually read the gospel who know sign language, but they don't understand written words. And so again, they know what church needs to look like, so that people who otherwise would never hear the gospel, never be included in church, can actually hear that and find a place.
I love those stories, John. And as you were talking, I had images, right, in my head. But I think what I appreciate that is I bet each of the church leaders listening to this podcast can imagine some folks like that, right? That are new to the faith, on fire, and trying to figure out what to do with it, or they're struggling with what that means for their family or them to show up in church, and the empowerment, right, of saying, well, what would that look like? How could you begin to gather? And so I just guess I want to encourage our listeners to give some permission to thinking through how who around them in their communities and their networks might be worth nudging into thinking about this. So
Yeah, that's so helpful, Terry. And I'm a church leader. I know what it feels like to lead church, and so for those guys who are doing that, first thing to say is that it can feel quite a threatening thing to think, actually, I'm going to release people to do this. I'm going to send them away almost. I'm going to say, don't come and serve in this ministry. I'm going to ask you to stay connected, but actually step out of this in order to form something new. It feels threatening in terms of it could go wrong. It could, I'm losing a really good resource and person within my church community. But we do it for two reasons. One is for the sake of the lost who otherwise won't connect with church. And the second is for the release of people into their calling, their vocation, and the potential of what that happens. And if we can begin to have in our heart that the greatest joy that we have is when we see somebody else fulfilling their calling and being fruitful for God and seeing their purpose in Him, then that will really begin to shift your heart. And in terms of recognizing them, firstly, they can be the most awkward person in your church who's always saying, why don't we do this? Why aren't we trying that? Why can't we? And actually, to then suddenly realize that might actually look like the call of God. It's not just that they're just always coming up with ideas, but there's something of the Spirit in them pushing them outwards and saying, we've got to try something over here. So you might find them in the frustration of, what do I do with this person? You might find them in the sign of them just being naturally fruitful, where you discover, people gather around that person, or people are beginning to be drawn to faith by that person. But they're doing that in a community that doesn't easily just connect back into church. So maybe I should be asking them and releasing them into that. Or you can find them by actually releasing a missionary call into your church community by saying, guys, we're not touching this part of our community, or God's laid it on my heart that we really need to create church in this context. Is anybody else sensing that call? And yeah, my encouragement is that the greatest thing that you can do as a church leader is to call out the possibility of this in somebody. It's really moving for me, but it's often quite sad that people on our Myriad pathway, when I ask them what's been the most profound thing, they will consistently say to me, my leadership and my call has been validated. It's the first time in my church that anybody's really seen who I am and what I have to offer. And that's not because we don't want that to happen. It's because we're busy. We're overwhelmed by everything that we have to do. But if we can just flip our mindset and say, who might God be calling? Who's the Phil, or who's the Denise who formed the community for special needs families? Who are they in my church? Who could God be calling? Who might I be missing unless I actually just stop and look and see people with fresh potential? And just by asking the question, that's where it starts. Now, you might not have Myriad, you might not have all the resources that you need, but the starting point is just beginning to have that conversation.
John, thank you so much for sharing your stories and wisdom. You've edited a book with some of those stories called Send Me. And where can people find that? And also, how can people learn more about Myriad?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so you can find that on Amazon, if we're allowed to say that, in terms of online, and so you can find that. And there's some other elements of what I've written around in a book called The Church of Tomorrow, as well, that shares a little bit more about the principles around all of this. But if you visit us at myriad.church, then you can see some more stories there, some resources that we're building up. And yeah, even in the last question that you asked, there's some resources there around how do we have discernment conversations with potential leaders and things like that. So feel free to get in touch with us through that. We're really keen to serve wherever there's an opportunity to. And so even though we can't deliver training everywhere, we're happy to release resource if that's helpful to people.
Well, John, thanks for being on the Pivot podcast today, and more importantly, for you and all of your leaders at Myriad for the work that you're doing. It's I think, really a great example for us to learn from about being church today.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thank you, Dwight. Real privilege to be with you.
And to our audience, thanks for tuning in today and joining us for this episode of the Pivot podcast. You can, as always, help us spread the word about Pivot by liking and subscribing to us on YouTube or any of the platforms that you're getting your podcasts on, and always share this with a friend. And we will see you next week.